Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. Same as always. How's Texas?
It's fine. It's getting warmer, but all is well over here in the new world. I'm happy though. Today we get to talk about the old world as we're wont to do, and we have a special guest joining us who is Georgia Giholy. And Georgia is a great young writer who has written for The Critic, The Spectator, First Things, The Catholic Herald, and other publications. And today we're going to talk to her about a piece she wrote for The Catholic Herald a few weeks ago that Bobby, you and I both really enjoyed reading because it brought up a lot of ideas that we talk about a lot, namely the question of Europeanness and kind of the idea of what it means to be European and how that relates to the Christian faith and the Catholic faith. But we're going to start off by talking about a visit to a museum that Georgia made. But first of all, we'll just welcome Georgia. Georgia, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, so good to have you. So we're gonna get into some ideas here in just a minute, but maybe you could set the table for us a little bit by telling us about this exhibition that you visited in Warsaw. So we'll just leave it at that. Tell us about this museum visit that you made.
Yes, so the site itself is, well, if you walk past in this neighborhood, you wouldn't miss it because it's essentially an absolutely huge building. It's a huge cross outside of it, and so it has a few different levels. Part of it is a museum dedicated to Pope John Paul II and Primate Wyszynski. My apologies for any Polish people listening. He was a Polish cardinal. And also right downstairs there's something called the Temple of Divine Providence, which it sounds kind of almost pagan, but it's actually a Catholic church, but it also has a lot of memorials and dedications to kind of famous Polish patriots throughout history. And then they have an exhibition space, and so this exhibition that's currently being held, it's about Pope John Paul II and Robert Schuman. Obviously, everyone knows who Saint John Paul II is or was, if you're listening to this podcast. Robert Schuman, he's not really sort of internationally famous anymore. He was a European statesman kind of during and after the Second World War. He was sort of, I guess you would say, quite cosmopolitan because he was sort of French and German because he was born, in this time when those identities in certain areas of that part of Europe weren't necessarily, exactly distinct because he was born somewhere in Luxembourg. He spoke a dialect of German. So the language they speak now in Luxembourg, the state language in Luxembourg is called Luxembourgish, but it's kind of one of those retcons. It really is just a dialect of German that's had stuff added to it after the war so they can kind of pretend that it's not German. And then he lived in France and was a French statesman. Of course, he was fluent in French too, so he had those kind of overlapping identities, I suppose you would say. So they come from quite different backgrounds, but they both, and obviously the main difference between them is that Robert Schuman was obviously a layman and St. John Paul II was a clergyman, but they both were very, very devout Catholics, and also they both had these similar but also different ideas about European unity. And especially after the devastation of both world wars, that's something that a lot of people were reconsidering at that time in the 1940s.
Yeah. Overall, what was your impression of the exhibition itself? I mean, were you impressed? Was there anything that, and I mean, in your article, you kind of go through these things, but is there anything else too that stood out to you?
Yeah, so the actual kind of physicality of the exhibition is pretty modest, even though the artwork is quite interesting, and it's they have these different boards, and depending on where you are standing on the room, they kind of you can see the boards connect, even though they're not actually next to each other, the pictures on them, which is quite interesting. But I think the main point about it is maybe for people like us in our field, in our circles, some of the stuff isn't necessarily breaking news, but I think in general, young people, and I'm sure it's slightly different in Poland, but maybe in the US, and at least my experience in the education system in the United Kingdom is a lot of these things about, the Christian roots of Europe, and even and including the European Union, and just that history in general, are, I would say, just completely ignored. And I think it sort of makes sense in a way, because obviously being a practicing Christian now is quite rare in the United Kingdom and lots of parts of Europe. But I think you can't really, regardless of your own beliefs, you can't really understand the history of Europe if you're not aware of that. And I mean, I was actually reading this piece in First Things the other day. I can't remember what the specific topic of the article was, but it referred to surveys which found that the vast majority of, I think, children in the United Kingdom, school children, they weren't familiar with, the story of Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, nor were they familiar with the virgin birth, which these are kind of very basic parts of, the biblical story and of Christianity that, pretty much anyone, even maybe 30 years ago, they would have heard of, whether or not they actually believed in them. So I think that the purpose of this exhibition, well, I suppose, I haven't actually spoken to the curator, so I think I'm not 100% sure, sorry, what their intentions were, but I think the most useful part of this is that it's portraying these, these two Christian Catholic statesmen and what they did, and it's explaining it kind of in simple terms to people who just kind of have, a basic understanding of the history, maybe. And also, it's not portraying them negatively, which I'm absolutely not saying that you cannot be critical of historical figures. Of course you can, regardless of who they are. That's absolutely your right as a a free citizen, or just as an observer of this kind of exhibition. But I think it's quite rare at the moment. Obviously, it's a little bit different in Poland. I think the younger generation is not necessarily as religious, for example, and obviously, Poland's a country like any other. It has its own set of problems and challenges, rather. I'm sure that's what the government probably call them, challenges, not problems. But I think it's just fresh to see that. I just can't really imagine something like this being in a huge museum in London. I think I just think either it wouldn't have been put there, or it would be negative towards Christianity, or it would maybe be focused on the European Union and pretty much ignore the contribution of Christianity.
In Poland, it's interesting. There's some people who introduce themselves as European instead of Polish. And
there are British people who do that too.
Okay,
even after Brexit.
Oh, okay. So it's not unique to Poland, but it's interesting though. Like, there's a lot of Poles who you still have this kind of current of conservatives who are just only really critical of the EU, and they don't really maybe get into too much of the founding fathers or even explore John Paul II's writings on this and engagement with the EU, but it's only the criticism. So I thought your piece was interesting because there's a little bit of a kind of an appreciation for looking at the Christian foundations of the EU, but also it seemed like you had a little bit of an issue with the exhibition itself.
Yeah, so I think there's that tradition in Poland of kind of people who are very, very anti-EU and people who are more pro-EU. And obviously we know that tradition definitely exists, in England and in the United Kingdom, because obviously, first of all, we're obviously in many ways distinct from the continent anyway, but also obviously we left the European Union a few years ago after we had a referendum on this. So we know that those traditions definitely exist here. But I think, even on the sort of anti-EU side, which I suppose I would broadly put myself in, I did vote to leave the European Union, but that's not to say that I necessarily thought that my government would do a good job of doing that, and guess what, it didn't. But it's sort of, for me, it was more of like a principle thing. And so I think that's really because, and that's sort of what this exhibition sort of ignores, is that the EU now, it really doesn't resemble the vision of someone like Robert Schuman. and nor is it necessarily fit to deal with the challenges that maybe someone like him back in the 40s, wouldn't have even been able to imagine. And I think, it's very kind of, obviously the EU has, there's limitations to its dominance, but places like, Poland and Hungary, they're in a different position to the UK because obviously they're sort of, their economies are growing, but it's from a sort of lower point than the United Kingdom, and they have maybe more limitations in terms of how they can operate just because of where they are. So they have all these borders. Obviously Poland has a coast, but Hungary doesn't, for example, nor do lots of other European countries, which might be in some ways more conservative than Brussels. So they sort of, it's hard to imagine, you often see these sort of like over the top, right-wing influence on Twitter who are like, oh, Poland's going to leave the EU, blah, 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 because, I don't know, Donald Trump said he doesn't like the EU or something. I mean, that's actually not going to happen. So yeah, it's financially, it's not possible at the moment if the EU still exists. And I think that leaves these countries in a precarious position because there are so many things they disagree with Brussels on. But Brussels has this very kind of one-size-fits-all approach, and it wants to really impose these strains of progressivism. And also, I'm not just saying that there are places in Eastern and Central Europe that disagree, because, of course, there are huge sections of the population, in France and Spain and Germany itself, and of course in the UK, which is formerly part of the EU, that disagree with these approaches. And I just think it's hard to know where that's going to end up, because I just worry really about the future, because we have kind of increasing division between different groups, and then we have, obviously, we really do have a huge issue with mass immigration in Europe, which the EU is sort of complacent about, or maybe is even in favour of. But regardless of what your opinion is on that, you can definitely say it's created kind of isolated segments of societies that don't respect the rule of law or the host culture. And I think if you leave this for 50, 100 years, there are going to be issues, and it's something that someone like Robert Schuman wouldn't have been able to even imagine. St. John Paul is a little bit different, just because obviously he was alive for a lot longer. He died in 2003 or something like that, so he saw some of these issues brewing. But to be fair to him, he was kind of, he in general thought he was, in favor of kind of European, friendship, if that's the word, and cooperation. But he didn't, agree with this centralized Brussels bureaucracy that could impose its will willy-nilly across the continent. He absolutely didn't agree with that. And I'm sure if he, was somehow still alive today, he'd be probably too old to be alive today. I'm sure he would be expressing that, but probably in a more diplomatic way than maybe a politician would. And I think an interesting thing about this exhibition as well is that for some reason it referred to these two statesmen, and obviously St. John Paul II being a saint as well, and they referred to them as being opposed to nationalism and totalitarianism, as if this kind of Christian democracy was like a third option. But I don't really know why they put nationalism on a par with totalitarianism, because totalitarianism in itself, like the word itself, implies negativity, I guess, unless you're a totalitarian, which most people will probably at least not admit to being. But nationalism, I mean, it can mean so many different things. And this is a site that, obviously, I was saying, they have this pantheon of great Poles, which houses the tombs of these, distinguished patriots, which are well loved across Poland, and, celebrate really Polish sovereignty, which has been under threat many, many times, by fascism, by invading powers, by communism, of course, as well, and which ended pretty recently. And I think it's interesting they use that word. I don't know if it could even be because maybe the people who are in charge of this exhibition, maybe English isn't their first language, and they chose the word nationalism, but maybe they meant something else like fascism. I'm not 100% sure, and I don't really know any Polish, so I wouldn't know maybe what the word would be that they would usually use. So I'm not 100% sure, but it's interesting, and I think that's the kind of error that I think would definitely creep in any kind of exhibition, maybe in London or New York, because it's possibly more likely that the people who were curating it there would view any kind of nationalism as evil. But I think on this site, it could well be that whoever organised this exhibition was very progressive, but I thought that it was interesting just because of the patriotic nature of this building and this site. So I don't know if that was a mistake, but I guess it was an interesting mistake that makes you think, even if it was a mistake.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm really glad you drew that out, Georgia, in your piece and now talking to us, this equation of nationalism with totalitarianism. And, somebody, just a brief excursus here, somebody who praised Robert Schuman was Pope Benedict XVI, and we're not really here to talk about him, but, he, in this great little book that I'll hold up for you to see, A Turning Point for Europe, he talks about sort of the great hour of Christian statesmen after World War II, and he praises Robert Schuman as one of those figures. Now, Schuman was, as you've said, like one of these almost stateless men in a way. I mean, and so in a way, you can understand why the kind of non-nationalist or anti-nationalist European people sort of might latch on to him as this sort of figure who transcended borders or something like that. But another figure that Benedict XVI praises is Charles de Gaulle, who, of course, I mean, certainly is not anti-nationalist, right? But that said, Benedict XVI himself, perhaps because he was German and grew up in the Third Reich. I mean, he himself expresses a lot in this very book, expresses reservations specifically about nationalism. But I'm not so sure, and maybe Bobby knows more about this than I do, but I'm not so sure John Paul II would do the same thing, precisely because he's Polish. And because my understanding is that patriotism and nationalism is not really that separable in the Polish mindset, which was able to endure for countless generations as a people, even as they were being dominated and oppressed by one group or another, right? So anyway, I just think that's interesting that they chose to make that point specifically with regard to John Paul II in that exhibition. So I don't know, just throw it back to you and see what you think about that.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's an urge to separate nationalism and patriotism, especially kind of in the debate in Britain about these things, because the sort of the BBC, the Guardian, they think anyone who waves a St George's flag or something is a racist, and they hate all immigrants, things like that, which is obviously ridiculous to kind of any normal person. And it doesn't really make sense to divide patriotism and nationalism, because nationalism, it simply really means that you believe in the good of the nation state, and obviously patriotism is loving your country, which in modern times, that is the nation state. Not to say that nations can't exist without a nation state, or they didn't exist before modern nation states, because they absolutely did. But this is the situation we find ourselves in now. So I suppose you could say on the one hand we should reclaim the word nationalism, because it kind of has negative connotations where it really shouldn't, because people immediately associate it with for example, Nazi Germany, which is kind of quite a parochial way to think about nationalism. But these are people who they've probably had this rubbish rammed down their throats, in the media and in the education system. So I suppose you can't really blame them. But yes, I mean, I think when nationalism can become a problem is obviously when, I suppose, the nation becomes an idol, and it becomes maybe more important than anything else, more important than faith, more important than the family, when really it should just be kind of one cog in this sort of, I guess, machine of civilization. But I think, nationalism can absolutely exist without becoming that. And I think actually, look, not every country is the same, not every period of history is exactly the same, but I think you know, a nation state is a useful kind of bulwark against, you know, excessive internationalism, which would be, I suppose, I guess you could say that, you know, the Soviets and the Nazis were in some ways internationalists because they wanted to kind of force their ideas down, you know, across the world, even though obviously they were limited in their success. And obviously, you know, obviously with the Nazis, they did have this vision of the German nation or whatever as being superior as well. On top of that, so it's not just that they wanted to take over the world, for example, or take over Europe even. But yeah, I think it's hard to say. I mean, certainly, you know, Pope John Paul II's experience, as you're saying, will be different because he was a Pole. But that's not to say that German nationalism has to be viewed as wrong. Because obviously you can be a proud German patriot and of course not be, you know, not be a Nazi, for example. But I think yeah, it's hard to see where this goes because, you know, Poland's a little bit different because I would say it's sort of still a little bit more conservative than places like Germany and England. But you know, in places like Germany and England, we have hate speech laws and such things that mean that sometimes, you know, simply, you know, believing that your country should exist can be a crime, which is, you know, scandalous really, and that's obviously not something that any of these people we've mentioned would agree with,
Yeah.
regardless of kind of their skepticism about where things went in the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of Poles kind of react. They're like, "Hey, we've been fighting for so many centuries. I mean, well, 123 years, and we have our independence, and then it's taken from us, and then we, you know, have our so-called liberation in 1989." But it was like through the language. If you read John Paul II's Memory and Identity, it's like it's a nice interview with him. With I believe it's between Tishner's part of that and another great Polish philosopher, but they really get at his understanding too of nationalism. I can't think off the top of my head exactly what he says in that, but for the Poles, it was like the strategy of you know having a rebellion and an uprising, you know, taking back power was just failing. So they switched to, hey, no, we need to really cultivate the, you know, make sure it's our culture that remains. And so the language and, you know, the poets and so many others, if you look at those guys in the late 19th, early 20th century, what they were doing for the rebirth of the nation, they saw a lot of that there. So for the Poles, I mean, to take away the sense of one's pride in one's nation, the Narod, is a huge threat. But you know, I thought that it's really interesting. Yeah, John Paul II's, you know, encouraging this concept of Europe. So I loved in your piece that you get into you know, like the 19th century, the word Europe. Was it the 19th century that you actually? I'm trying to pull this up in the piece. That the word Europe starts to be used, the mid 19th century, and you say that it would have just been simply Christendom would have sufficed to explain this. So, I mean, could you maybe getting into a little bit like the question that you ask, what is Europe? What does it stand for or against? I mean, I know you don't develop it too much in the article, but like let's explore that a little bit. Yeah, Christendom, Europe. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term Europe is obviously, you know, the word Europe, I think it is from Latin or Greek, but and it was used as some kind of, you know, vague geographical term for the area, which has obviously existed for a very long time in I think ancient Greece. But you know, until fairly recently, people wouldn't necessarily, I think, walk around and use Europe to kind of talk about, you know, this collection of countries in this area. In the northwest, obviously, like it's a supercontinent. It's Europe and Asia and Africa are connected by land. People would refer to Christendom, which is interesting because when you even say the word Europe, people obviously still debate what that includes.
Yeah.
And people would say, well, obviously we're connected by, land to Asia, blah, blah, blah. But, really, it would end at the Urals, which is a more kind of geographical comment because that's kind of a big block. But you wouldn't say Europe ends at the Alps just because there's a mountain range there, would you? So it's really talking about, I suppose, the expansion of Christian civilization. And I think, this, of course, there were various tribes which had, pagan tribes that had similarities and things kind of before Christianity spread. But there was no kind of common civilization really until, I suppose, the Roman Empire took these places and eventually Christianity spread. And then, of course, in antiquity, when you have the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and you have kind of these sort of heathen invaders, and then later on you have threats from the Islamic world, this really helps those Christian nations and peoples. They're not unified nation states in the sense that a modern nation state would be, even though England is more centralized early on than a lot of its continental cousins. It's really against those external threats, and the reason why those threats are external is because they're not Christian. So, for example, in England, you have obviously, the Viking invasions, and that kind of helps English nationhood evolve, because previously it was sort of you had the Anglo-Saxon groups and the Romano-Brittonic peoples who were Christian there before, and the Anglo-Saxons earlier on, they weren't Christian, but they became Christian through various processes, and similar sort of processes on the continent. Obviously, there are parts that became Christianized quite later on, sort of during the Crusades. And you had obviously these Baltic Crusades happening in places like Poland, where they were trying to, convert more kind of Slavic peoples to Christianity. And yet, obviously, for a long time, parts of the Balkans and Central Europe were under, Muslim rule. And of course, Spain was also under Muslim rule, Sicily, I think other parts of southern Italy for a bit, and I think Malta as well. And, Europe wasn't really a singular place, nor has it ever been. But there was definitely acknowledgement that these Christian states, even though sometimes they're invaded and things like that, that they had something in common, even if they were also fighting each other all the time. They definitely had something in common. And obviously the Great Schism impacted that, the Protestant Reformation impacted that, but there was still a sense of some sort of unity. And you do see bits of that, pop up in, I think, the 16th century and 17th century, when there have been these breakdowns in Christian unity. But there are still some kind of, uniformity against, for example, the threat from the Ottomans. Even though I think at one point France allied itself with the Ottomans in the 16th century to try and, I don't know, get one over on.
Even the Pope was, I
Yes.
think, calling up the Ottomans to, save them from the French, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah. So, none of this is kind of, there's no, there was no sort of simple timeline and everything stands for all of this time, but there is definitely a sense of this. And people do actually, sometimes still in England, maybe older people, they'll use the phrase Christendom, like they'll say something, I haven't seen this in all of Christendom. That's something that older people will still say, even though it's probably quite an archaic term now, because people don't necessarily view where they live in Europe as Christian anymore. It speaks to kind of that sense of it, even though, if you're in a village, I don't know, in the Ukraine, or you live in a city in Italy, or you live, in the fjords of Norway, or you live in Ireland, you're having a very different experience. But there is a uniformity there because of the Christian past, and for some people still the Christian present.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of people in Europe today, on the continent of Europe today, don't appreciate. I mean, it's been said by a lot of people that, that there's nothing particularly distinguishing about kind of, the EU's documents. It's what it says about itself. I mean, the fact that, and you mentioned this in your piece, the fact that the capital is in Brussels of all places. I mean, no one in, like, for ages and ages would have thought like that's the heart of Europe, right? I mean, it would have been Rome, for example. I mean, it would have
Yeah.
been like, the more obvious like capital, because that's where Christendom was based, right? But somebody like Robert Schuman, and I think Konrad Adenauer and de Gaulle and others as well. I mean, I don't think that they were seeking just to create a kind of economic zone, as some people might say. But nor do I think they were trying to just create some kind of, you know, plain vanilla, we could be anywhere kind of transnational or globalist kind of system of governance. I mean, it seemed like they were, I guess we could say even somewhat naively imagining that in the wreckage of World War II, that there could be born some kind of new Christian imperium. And the
Mhm.
fact was, it just kind of wasn't to be, I suppose.
Yes, and also, so I think you're right. It wasn't purely economic even from the outset because there were people with these grander visions. Though I think, of course, you're saying like there's the free trade motivation, but also I think their vision of the political cooperation, at least on this Christian democracy side, was kind of community and cooperation rather than a unified, European superstate, which was the idea of some other people. I suppose on the more authoritarian left, and I suppose some people on the authoritarian right too. Though I think that's rare now. Um, but I think, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was trying to remember. I was trying to remember what I was going to say.
Oh, well, no,
Um,
it wasn't fair to you because I was opining and then kind of asked for your feedback. But I mean, maybe we could refocus on the idea of, you say, what drew me in immediately reading your piece was your first sentence: Europe is as much an idea as it is a place. And for me, well, for Bobby and I both, Bobby lives in Europe now, but we're both American citizens, and both deeply formed by experiences in Europe. I mean, I lived in England for a while, and I speak French and German, and I mean, I'm a lifelong Christian, and so I mean, I just can't help but feel that I'm European somehow. And then when I read people like Remy Bragg and people like that, I feel affirmed in that kind of feeling that I've had in my heart my whole life. And
Yeah.
I guess it's something that I'm still processing. How that looks in the world going forward when, on the continent itself, many of the people anyway, who live there kind of don't have that same sense of identity anymore, that, we are European in the sense that our ancestors were Christian and lived on this land, and, that kind of a thing.
Can I say something here too? Because you mentioned the thing about Brussels and not in Rome, but just going like with Remy Bragg's book, his book, what is it called? Eccentric, is it Eccentric Culture?
Eccentric culture in English, yeah.
Yeah, but he talks about it's not so much, Athens or Jerusalem, but it's Rome. And I was just talking to one of my colleagues. He's a Portuguese guy, and he's just like, man, we're just Romans with electricity. Um, and I'm like, yeah, it seems to be right. But yeah, even growing up in America, I mean, and this is not some kind of like, oh, I'm just looking back to Europe, but you just feel like you're still in that thing, despite
mm,
as new. I mean, I know a lot of people disagree with this, and maybe even Remy Bragg would, that America is very much, part of the modern project. And
mm,
so it's like its own, if you want to say it's its own new thing. But yet, nevertheless, it finds its roots there. But yeah, I feel like Europe in some ways is has always been like the source. So
mm.
I enjoyed. Sorry to cut you off there.
No, no, no. Yeah, I mean, I wonder what your reaction to something like that is, Georgia, as as somebody who
Mhm.
lives in the UK and who's writes this article about this experience of being in Poland and
Mhm.
learning about John Paul II and Robert Schuman. I mean, how do you, so you've said it, Europe is as much an idea as a place, but like, how do you think of things going forward? There you mentioned at the end of the piece that in some respects, Poland has its issues, but I mean, Poland is in some respects, you write, is arguably upholding Schumann's principles better than his native France or Germany.
Mhm.
And you also mentioned Hungary before. There's Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who seems to be sort of, very much committed to the EU, but also using language of, renewing a kind of language of faith that we haven't heard maybe from a lot of European leaders in recent times. And I don't know, I'm just wondering if there's like anything moving in Europe towards this, sort of more of a
Mm.
spirit of reconnecting with the roots.
I think in some circles there are, and I think even outside of political or religious Christian circles, I think that maybe people haven't found things to fill these holes, but I think people are really realizing that there are a lot of things lacking in modern life. Whether that's they've realized that part of that is likely, a lack of religious community. I think, among young people that it's growing, but it's still growing quite slowly. I think you mentioned kind of these politicians. I just think, some of them we can debate over whether some of them have useful ideas, some of them don't. But I just think, Europe has existed for a long time, and throughout that time, we've had many, duplicitous and many good politicians too. And I think it's hard to tell, but I think with so many of these really big threats at the moment, internally and externally, I think you could, as I'm saying, I think you could see a near future where something snaps, whether that's for the good or for the worst. I'm not 100% sure. We won't know, but I think a lot of people, maybe on the right of politics, I think, um, especially in the UK, because the UK, it's kind of more shocking to talk about religion than it is in the US. I think, and even just kind of, social conservatism, I think we have these huge issues kind of internally with, family breakdown. And I mentioned in here, Robert Schuman was active in politics before there was such thing as a contraceptive pill, which obviously completely changes human relationships. And I think that because those things, and abortion as well, I think they've become so kind of convenient in modern society, and they change the dynamics of how everything works. Really, I think it's hard to see a majority of people wanting to reject that, and I think morally that's an issue. And then also you just talk about practically, I mean, we have very low birth rates. You could say that some of that's for economic reasons, but I think it's also when the culture gets to the point where people sort of dislike having children, or they think that it's wrong for the environment or something like that, or just, I don't know, people are addicted to social media or something and they're not meeting each other, and they don't believe in marriage anymore. I think these things kind of help, gradually kind of grind down parts of civilization on an individual and a family level. And so it makes it open to threats from things like Islamic extremism, or, you know, it means that maybe the economy, there are politicians who find it very easy to make arguments to import very large numbers of people from cultures from across the globe, um, which kind of to fill, what they say are, gaps in the workforce and things because people have less children. But obviously, that's not necessarily sustainable for a nation. So I think we have a lot of different challenges, and I'm not really sure how that they will end or be resolved. But what you were saying as well about sort of Europe being an idea, I think Historians in the future would definitely look at the United States as, even though it's so different from the continent, I think they would definitely look at it as a quote unquote European civilization.
Hmm.
It's part
Hmm.
of that kind of world, even though it's physically removed from it. It absolutely is. I mean, but I suppose the question is really the Europe that we're living in 50 years' time. Would historians still look at that as part of European civilization? I don't know, because I don't know where things are going. I imagine somewhere like Poland will change slower if it does change more towards something like the UK. But it'll probably still change. But I suppose what someone like St. John Paul II and Robert Schuman would say is, don't put your faith in human institutions and politics and those kinds of things, because they will always be unpredictable and they will probably disappoint you.
Yeah, it's worth. I know you may want to ask another question, Bobby, but I just wanted to comment real quick on. I think that was really astute of you, Georgia, to note that about just kind of the world that Robert Schuman was in, thinking about what would become the European Union, was that they were so close. The thinkers of that time were so close to all these enormous changes that were about to hit Western society, and they just didn't see them coming. They just flat out did not see them coming. And that includes very much birth control, but it also includes, a lot of historians have written about this, but this includes the fact that the leaders of these European nations after World War II just didn't imagine that as these great colonial empires crumbled, that all the peoples of these former colonial countries would actually want to
Yeah.
come to Europe and live in the old, in a sense, like oppressors' lands. I mean, they just did not imagine that was something. In fact, I think they thought it might go the other way. That people would want to go live in that the populations of France or England or whatever would sort of burst and they would want to sort of go out somewhere else. And it's not proved to be true. So I don't know. That's just an interesting historical phenomenon to take into consideration.
Yeah, also, I mean, France and the United Kingdom still seem to be under the impression that they, won the Second World War, when really America and the Soviet Union won the Second World War. We
That's
didn't.
right. That's
Yeah,
right.
not to downgrade obviously some of the, amazing courage and things that were involved on the British side. Of course, that was important, but basically we quote unquote won because of America and the Soviet Union, and also they won in terms of getting their share of the spoils, basically.
Hmm.
And I think we still haven't really come to terms with that.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about that the other day when you had in St. Peter's Basilica at the funeral right before, I think it was before the funeral mass for Pope Francis,
Mm.
Trump and Zelensky and
Mhm.
Macron walks up, and there was I
Mm.
saw on Twitter some like lip reader saying he's saying to like Macron, oh, you can't be part of this discussion or something like that. And
Yeah.
Macron just goes, oh, okay. And I just was thinking, all right, man. Yeah, I guess Trump kind of has that view. You hear so many people from the Trump side talking about like Europe. Oh, well,
Mm.
I heard Tucker Carlson the other day say, "Oh, Europe. Oh my gosh, what a joke Europe is." But the thing that bothers me with that though is that
Mm.
they, not even to get into the Russia stuff yet, but like
Mm.
let's focus on the Gulf states, because that's really, the Gulf states really should be our allies. But it just like doesn't seem, and now I'm getting a
Oh,
little
you're
bit,
saying, Bobby, that's kind of the
Mm.
American foreign policy position now. Like, we don't want our old European alliances anymore, but
well,
we
I
want
mean, I was
other ones.
listening to this, what's his name? Witkoff? What's his name? Anyways,
I'm not sure.
Witkoff going talking about Qatar and in Saudi Arabia as if, somehow we're like the same thing. We're just like, this is the
Mm.
best place to invest. And they're talking about it purely in kind of like, from okay, I get the economic point of view and maybe all the stuff with the internet, connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia. But I'm like, wait a minute, you can't just dismiss Europe, so easily like this. And yes, I get Trump's frustrations with, particularly, Germany, Berlin, maybe France. And also be a little careful about Russia too. It's interesting to listen to polls because polls are, very supportive
Mhm.
of, generally speaking. I've like, typically when you ask a poll, you per what, German or Russian, they'll say American, please. Sorry, they like
Yeah,
the Brits too, but well, actually, take that back. I
not
teach
anymore.
I
I think
teach
they're
I
still
teach
annoyed with us about the Second
some
World War.
yeah, I teach some students. Whenever I bring up Churchill, I have this kid named
Yeah.
Evo, and he just goes off on Churchill like, for 5 minutes. Anyways,
Because Britain went to war over Poland and then left Poland
because
to
of
the
Yalta.
Soviets
What
at the
happened
end.
at
Yeah,
Yalta? Okay, they
Mm,
yeah.
feel like the greatest betrayal. But
sorry.
anyways, what was I getting at? But anyways, the Russia to talk though, like, okay, hey, now we should just like, and how does Russia view that inheritance? I know we're getting into some,
Yeah.
grounds, but Russia's really interesting because, Andrew, when
Mm,
you brought up that book by Benedict, and he's written a lot of books on Europe, but one of his essays, he talks about Cardinal Lemp of Warsaw, bringing up the question at some I think synod of bishops, what is Europe? And he's like, yeah, does it end at the Ural Mountains because technically Russia goes all the way to Siberia, all the way to the Pacific, right?
mm,
And so it's getting at this thing. And right now, I mean, I feel like more than anything, I guess this is the point I'm trying to make, is America should really, really, despite all the problems, should be, affirming its friendship with Europe
mhm.
instead of like destroying it. It's like what seems to be the case to me.
Yes, I think look, when it comes to international affairs, you know, countries don't always have the luxury of, being, 100% moral when it comes to who they're negotiating with or trading with, for example. But I think just kind of on a kind of visceral kind of reaction basis, I'm thinking about, an American diplomat saying, we love Qatar versus we love Italy. I just think the latter option sounds more amenable to me. And I think, it makes sense to kind of negotiate economically with these places. But I think there's a danger of becoming reliant on places like that for resources, especially obviously, hydrocarbons. But also civilizationally, what do we have? I say we because I'm saying obviously I'm not American, but we, as I'm saying, I think are part of this European world or story, even though we're very far apart geographically. I think we have so much more in common, and we have, we're sort of, we should have some of the same aims. And I think that somewhere like Qatar, I mean, I think I understand why there are lots of Americans who are frustrated with, funding certain foreign funding and things like that. And I know that there's a lot of frustration on the American right in particular over the Ukraine conflict. And that really comes as well from obviously the issues with other conflicts in the Middle East before that. I think people are just very tired. But I think, saying this as a non-American, obviously I can't vote in America. I'm just saying this, it's my opinion. Um, if America wants to still be the world superpower, obviously it has to have, military or spending overseas. And you can argue about where that should be directed more towards and things like that. But America will not necessarily continue to be as prosperous if it doesn't have at least some, foreign interest. That's just the reality. And I think it would be very short-sighted to just completely dismiss Europe, even though I understand the frustration with certain European leaders. And obviously, I mean, Europe isn't a monolith, like you're saying. Poles are pretty pro-American, and I would say that the UK. in general is fairly pro-American, even though lots of British people have this kind of over-the-top reaction to Trump. I don't know if it's just his personality is seen as, I guess, the opposite, the opposite to sort of an English gentleman, you know. Um,
Yeah.
but I think a lot of people obviously sort of, you know, they do understand some of his decisions. So yeah, I think it's hard to say, and I think there's so many moving parts. But I think it would be, and I'm not sure if this is on the table. I think it would be absolutely bizarre and kind of anti-civilizational to just say, "Oh, we had an argument with, you know, Christine Lagarde or someone, so you know, we must now just be best friends with, you know, Doha or Riyadh, or you know, Abu Dhabi, because they have money and because they have oil." And also, I think, you know, these places obviously have, you know, they're growing a lot. There are, you know, a lot of Western expats who go there for like to work on jobs that are associated with these resources they have. But you know, oil doesn't last forever either. So I think you need a longer term outlook, economically and sort of culturally too. And you know, of course, Europe is frustrating, and European leaders have their own interests, as do American ones, but so do Middle Eastern ones. And I mean,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Middle East isn't exactly the most peaceful place on earth, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a bit of a shift. I get it because of some of our military adventurism of past decades. We've had a bit of a shift in the United States, especially on the right, back towards more of a realpolitik, I suppose. But I do worry that we're going to lose our principles a little bit, and as you say, kind of not play a long enough game, which to my mind, actually, even though America is a much more, supposedly much more religious place than most European countries, and our population is more church going, although that's declining, I actually believe it reveals a kind of spiritual sickness and a lack of spiritual rootedness that we could just so easily sort of dismiss Europe as, oh, just some other place, any other old place out there in the world, rather than, you know, a place that we are bound to not only kind of by, you know, because we're in NATO together and that kind of thing, but just spiritually that we're connected.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I
yeah.
think it's kind of, I'm trying to think of what I would compare it to, but I just think it's very kind of a sort of fast food mindset. Like, I want what I want
Mhm.
and I want it now, and I'm going to abandon everything else, or something that might take a bit more work, to kind of set right. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not saying, of course, that America should sort of set all of its fortunes on Europe. I think that would also, you know, be not sensible. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe in some kind of, you know, long game, you know, maybe the pressure that is being put on European nations to
Mm,
increase their defense spending or to kind of take more seriously certain concerns that the American establishment has will maybe bring us closer together in some
mm.
strange way. I don't know. It could be. I don't know. Um, but I don't know. We're running short on time now. But Bobby, any last questions you want to ask Georgia before we sign off?
No, no, this is just an edifying conversation. You know, to talk about all of this, and I mean, I really, I mean, I got actually to be honest with you, I got a little bit down about some tweets by a fellow Brit yesterday about
Ooh.
America. It was, yeah, it was just really, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is being said and how they don't
Mm.
understand the American right,
Who was
but.
it, by the way?
Oh yeah, I shouldn't. John Milbank. He said something about
Friend of the show,
yes,
Oh,
John
friend of the
friend
show.
of
Milbank.
the
Yeah, we follow
show.
each
That's
other
right.
as well.
But
Yeah,
I was
Yeah.
like, how can you, you know, it just
yeah.
felt like he totally misunderstood
Okay, interesting. Yeah,
anyway, I'm not going to bring that up. But
yeah.
anyways, it was very inspiring to talk to a Brit who, you know, seems, you know, like she understands the situation in America
Nice.
and is very at the same time pro European. So
Mhm.
no, thanks for coming on. And I love, by the way, I just want to say I love your little like one of your lines about Berlin. Have you checked out this book? What is it called? It's Peter Hitchens recommended it, and it's
Cool.
on I forget the name of it, but it's something about Berlin, and it's a British diplomat who saw that everybody looked to Angela Merkel to see what the EU should do.
Oh,
So, anyways,
no, I'm
I'll
not
maybe
familiar with that, but I need to
okay.
find that.
I'll send you
Hmm.
once I get off. I have the book
Okay,
on
thank you.
Kindle, and I'll send that over to you.
Okay, well,
Well,
thank you for
Georgia,
inviting me on. Thank you.
yeah, thank you for joining us. And I realize we've led you down a long garden path here on the basis of an article that you wrote about a visit to a museum in Warsaw. So thank you so much for humoring us and for kind of following us where we wanted to go. Just once again, I want to commend to our listeners that they check out your article, which is called "New Exhibition in Warsaw: Ambitiously Examines Saint John Paul II's and Robert Schumann's Vision of European Unity." That's by our guest Georgia Giholy in the Catholic Herald. Georgia, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Be sure to share this episode with somebody who might like to hear it, and check out our website at spacesalviinstitute.com. Until next time, God bless and live in hope.